The 1990s was an incredible time period for wrestling and wrestlers. There was so many options for the wrestlers themselves and forced the companies to push and give their very best. The effects of the competition between the promotions wouldn't be felt up until 1995. WCW created their own Monday night show to fight with the WWF, and it was highly ambitious, brave, but they had the tools, not to mention the signing of Hulk Hogan from a year earlier. The WWF was stagnant throughout this time with very little movement, and if anything, they were moving backwards from a rating standpoint. The WWF's inability to retain talent was hurting them, but also allowed for the promotion to move forward and shed any association with the new generation. Another big player was emerging in the United States at this point, however: Eastern Championship Wrestling. ECW's early roots were very different to what the promotion had evolved into. The company opted to turn extreme. A major component of ECW's rise around the mid-90s was Paul Heyman becoming owner of the company. He opted to turn it into one of the most radical and trending type of promotion, in contrast to the traditional style that the WWF and WCW focused on. Heyman's influence over ECW certainly brought its way to the big two competition as the years went by. The Attitude Era in itself doesn't have an outright beginning. It slowly emerged into its own thing. By 1998, it was the Attitude Era. That year saw the most success for all three promotions. WCW had some issues, of course, but the company was red hot. Sting and the Wolfpack, Dennis Rodman, Bill Goldberg, and the WWF on the other hand had DX, Stone Cold, The Rock, and a huge supporting cast. This era of profanity, at times nudity and violence, was certainly growing on the audience, and it was welcomed. Raw and Nitro were sharing over 9 million viewers at one point. However, this wasn't sustainable. WCW's issues across the promotion were starting to actually put a dent in the product. The return of the NWO was not as exciting as the bookers thought, and in general, this time period for WCW was flat out confusing. Not to mention the show was 3 hours. Interest was slowly growing thin while WWF was enjoying their long-term success finally paying off. The WWF's booking at times was all over the place, and there's no denying that. But the magic and efforts from the wrestlers themselves overshadowed any shortcomings and made 1999 the WWF's most successful year on cable television. The summer in general with the corporate ministry against Stone Cold was absolutely heated in the best way possible, and the fans were all in on this. Stone Cold and The Undertaker's main event on the June 28, 1999 episode of Raw was viewed at one point by almost 11 million people. This philosophy that the WWF had drawn up was bringing them cash, rating success, and of course the #1 spot as the biggest professional wrestling promotion. So WCW, seeing what the company had created, felt inspired to do their own spin on it, and to top it all off, they brought in the head writer of the WWF, Vince Russo. With the creation of SmackDown, Vince Russo felt exhausted and uninterested in working for yet another show, so he left. WCW felt that they had struck gold because Russo's, of course, credited with the meteoric rise of the WWF in the last 3 years. He played a huge part, and it showed a bit for WCW. There was some rating success for the promotion, and it was a noticeable change. The ratings were significantly up, the morale improved, but as always, things took a turn, and 2000 marked the most significant downfall for a wrestling promotion. Now, WCW's fall had begun earlier, but these problems were exacerbated. Wrestlers were leaving, titles changed hands more than a dollar bill, and what was significant last week was nothing the next. WCW was in a very tough position. The hype of the Attitude Era was waning for everyone barring the WWF itself. 2000 was a very remarkable year for the company, and I believe was the most profitable year for the company, generating over $80 million in profit. The product was very exciting and continued the almost unstoppable momentum that the company had for years. While the WWF was continuing with business as usual, ECW was starting to learn long-term effects of being number 3. It wasn't necessarily the main reason that the company was suffering, it was because of the money. The reputation that ECW had built upon itself certainly stood out. It allowed for them to be perceived as something entirely different, however, this stifled them in the long run. ECW's success throughout the late 90s finally culminated with a television deal. Paul Heyman had been praying for this, as ECW already had financial problems in late 1998. He was buying time and convincing the locker room to remain calm after checks were bouncing, and there was discussions from multiple areas to bring in money for ECW. They were interested in making a game with either Take-Two or Acclaim, loans, and of course a TV deal. TNN was interested in airing ECW on their network, as wrestling was very big at the time, so a lot of these providers wanted their piece of the pie. ECW made a deal with TNN to air the show on Fridays in July of 1999. It was a huge morale boost and a shot in the arm for the company, whose status was doubtful. All was good on paper, but TNN should have known better that this wasn't going to end well. The network wanted ECW to tone it down across all the board. However, ECW didn't even try to pull up a well-behaved product even before the deal. There was still a lot of controversy and showed that Paul Heyman wasn't going to give in. So the deal wasn't looking too good before it officially began in August. TNN had huge expectations for ECW on their network. They believed that the show would debut to a 2.0 rating. They didn't. It was half. Paul Heyman quickly had issues with the network as they wanted their own production crew, while on the other side, he felt that TNN didn't do a good job in promoting the show. The tension between both sides was quickly rising with every passing week. However, on the surface, ECW was doing well. Acclaim had a 10% stake in the company. Not to mention the release of ECW Hardcore Revolution was a big success, selling over 600,000 copies and making the company bank. But bad news is of course more significant. Paul Heyman grew annoyed with TNN and their efforts towards making ECW a success. It got to the point where he created a heel authority figure played by Don Callis. However, all of these minor issues would be overlooked in an instant after it was revealed that TNN were interested in bringing WWF to their network. Raw's War was a massive success for USA Network, one of the top cable programs of the past couple of years, and the WWF felt that they weren't valued enough. Translation, they weren't being paid enough to feature on USA Network, so they took their show and decided to go shopping. ECW's relationship was strained, and with WWF out in the market, it was only going to get worse. Many believed that TNN wanted WWF the entire time and just used ECW for the time being, and it led to a time where Paul Heyman refused to compromise and water down the product for the sake of the business practices of network television. Heyman was beyond stressed at this point, and they found themselves in the same position as they were in 1999, and he had enough. USA Network was a potential candidate for the services of Extreme Championship Wrestling, however the investment required a lot of work done. The end of 2000 left ECW in an extremely questionable state. Paul Heyman couldn't maintain things like he did in the past, and everything was different about this one. What made this different is that multiple ECW wrestlers signed with the WWF. This wasn't happening at the time, as the company didn't want to make it seem like they were hurting ECW. If anything, they were giving them some cash. ECW was basically done, but it wasn't official. The wrestlers knew that this was over and even had a farewell in January of 2001. Tommy Dreamer told a story on the Stone Cold podcast about how ECW received a ridiculous offer. He was mostly in charge, and Heyman, on the other hand, was elsewhere. It ruined everything, and the deal was off the table because Heyman no-showed. Then there's a story from a few wrestlers talking about how Heyman promising to fight a TV deal in LA, but instead going to film Rollerball. Heyman refuted these claims, but ECW had piled up a huge amount of debt. Nobody was willing to accept a deal that would involve these tough conditions, and to top it all off, Paul Heyman debuted on Raw as a color commentator in March of 2001. That was the end of ECW, and the wrestlers saw the writing on the wall. Joey Styles gave an additional note to the debut of Paul Heyman and the closing of ECW, saying, "People don't understand. When you file for bankruptcy, any check you have written 90 days prior to that bankruptcy, that money can be recalled by any secured creditors. So Paul waited 90 days after ceasing operations so that nobody could come after the wrestlers for any money he had paid them. People shouldn't vilify Paul for that. People should thank Paul for that. He couldn't say anything. That's why Paul was on WWE television before ECW officially filed for bankruptcy." Extreme Championship Wrestling officially closed on April 4th, 2001, and that marked the end of one of the most radical, one of the most significant wrestling promotions in history. WCW's financial woes were starting to do a number on the company. For Time Warner, WCW was starting to become a liability. The promotion lost $60 million in 1999 and was a huge mark. Time Warner were ready to offload WCW and listen to potential buyers. Eric Bischoff managed to find backing and was the front runner. He knew the company well, had a big plan of taping shows in Las Vegas. However, the WWF was considering going for it as well. This was back in November of 2000. The deal would have gone down a lot differently at the time, with WWF actually running WCW as a promotion on TNT or TBS. But Viacom didn't like this, and a lot of other issues with the sale complicated the deal. So it was Bischoff. With the AOL Time merger happening at the same time, it felt like a done deal. However, the network executives didn't want to air WCW, and so a deal worth $73 million was hardly worth that at all. So the group backed off. Bischoff was off the deal, and it was all open again. WCW without a TV deal was essentially nothing. The company was initially supposed to be sold for $73 million, but instead it turned out to be sold for $4.2 million to the WWF. It's a ridiculous turnaround. They had the valuable tape library, the trademarks, and some contracts. This all came from out of nowhere, and to top it all off, Shane McMahon appeared on the final episode of Nitro. Many believe that the network executives just wanted to get rid of WCW because of its losses, not to mention they didn't want wrestling on the network. It's more so the latter, because if something doesn't make money, people are going to look at it differently. The WWF stood tall in the span of a month. March 2001 saw 3 major wrestling promotions, and by the end of the month, only one had remained, and the future of wrestling looked uncertain. The WWF, who was the undisputed number one, was going through some minor problems as well. After a very successful summer, creative took a slight change with Stephanie McMahon taking control, and the quality of the show took a hit. It wasn't that huge of a hit, but there was more mistakes from this time period. The move to TNN was a downgrade from a rating standpoint, as the channel was in fewer homes, and Raw, which went from drawing 5.7, 6.4s, a lot of 6s in there, to mid-5s, sometimes even 4s. It stifled them a bit, but these were still huge numbers, no doubt about it. USA Network would have provided the opportunity for more viewers. The build for WrestleMania 17 was absolutely incredible. However, this was as good as it was going to get. WrestleMania 17 was a massive success. It was critically acclaimed and financially the most successful WrestleMania of all time, and in many ways, it felt like the celebration of the Attitude Era, not to mention ended with Stone Cold aligning with Vince McMahon, his enemy. It's not the outright end, but everything felt different the next night, and many consider it to be the final night of the Attitude Era. Coupled with the purchase of WCW and the debut of the talent, it was the end. The environment of 2001 didn't really allow for WCW and ECW to continue. If they were around today, and obviously things are different now, they would have found a home, no doubt about it. I'm pretty certain they would have found a home, whether it's Hulu, Netflix, although I can't really imagine ECW on Netflix, even somewhere like Tubi. They'll have somewhere to be broadcasted for the world to watch. That just wasn't the case in 2001, and because of that, WWF was the last promotion standing. If there was a little patience with WCW, maybe they would have continued, but with ECW, they were done. It was just over. And because of all these elements, WWE just coasted along. They didn't feel like working as hard as they did during the Attitude Era. The Invasion storyline was crazy because you see all these talent who were from ECW, WCW, walk in and feud with the biggest wrestlers in the company. It was a disappointment, of course, and WWE's ratings started falling slowly, especially after Rock and Austin left. It was a tough time period, and ironically, the move back to USA Network with the rise of Batista and John Cena led to a slight increase in the viewers on Raw. So yeah. Alright, what did you guys think of the final days of the Attitude Era? Please comment down below, and that's it for this video. Make sure you hit the starter on the like button and perhaps the rock bottom on the subscribe button. Peace. I'm out.